My name is Eliza Clarke, and I wasn't supposed to speak at his funeral. Not because I didn't have anything to say, God knows I did, but because my father made it clear that I shouldn't. That day, standing in the back of the crowded church, hidden behind officers in polished uniforms and medals they probably hadn't earned, I watched as my father, former Police Chief Robert Clarke, took the podium and declared my brother Nate the last true legacy of our family. I was sitting only a few feet away, but it felt like 100 miles. He wore the badge with honor, my father said, chest puffed. He didn't hide behind desks or screens. He was out there in the field, like a real Clarke. I swallowed hard. I knew exactly what he meant. That was always his version of love: comparison, humiliation, disappointment. And yet, I didn't move. I let him say his piece, because I knew something none of them did. Nate had called me 12 hours before he died. He left a voicemail he probably never thought I'd need to play more than once. He told me not to trust the department, not to trust our father. And he told me, without ever saying the words, that he knew his time was running out. Before I go on, I want you to remember one thing. Stories like this don't go viral because they're loud. They stick because they feel like something you've lived through or almost did. And if you've ever been the one who sat quietly while someone else got the spotlight, or kept your head down just to survive a family dinner, then you'll understand what I'm about to share. If you feel that already, stick around. You're not alone. And if this hits close to home, maybe hit that subscribe button. Not for me, but for the version of you that's still trying to be heard. When the three men walked in, dark suits, steel jaws, badges clipped discreetly to their belts, you could feel the oxygen leave the room. The church went still, the same way it does before a storm breaks. They didn't look around. They walked straight toward me, parted a row of chairs like scripture, and said, "Agent Clarke, headquarters needs you now." My father looked like he'd been slapped. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. I didn't say a word. I stood up, reached into my coat, and for the first time in my life, pulled out my badge. FBI, Counterintelligence Division. The silence that followed was thicker than grief, because no one, not a soul in that room, had known the truth. For 6 years, I had worked undercover on high-level corruption cases. For 6 years, I sat in silence while my family assumed I was just some glorified secretary. And for 6 years, I let them believe it. I had my reasons. You don't grow up in a house like mine without learning that being loud gets you punished and being right gets you ignored. Nate was the golden boy. I was the girl who didn't have what it takes. They said it so often it started to echo in my bones. But here's the thing, the world doesn't always give you permission to be who you are. Sometimes, you just become it anyway in the dark, where no one's watching. I never told my family what I did, not because I was ashamed, because I didn't owe them that part of me. The only person who knew was Nate. And now, he was gone. They said it was a routine bust gone wrong. They said he died chasing a dealer through an alley, that he was brave and unlucky. But I know what fear sounds like. I heard it in his voice that night. And no matter how many flags they fold or speeches they read, I know my brother didn't die by accident. He found something that scared him, something worth dying over. And now it's mine to finish. I didn't come to that funeral to mourn. I came to investigate. And the person responsible for his death might have been sitting in the front row, shaking hands, smiling for the cameras, thanking people for their thoughts and prayers. Now tell me, if your whole life they told you to stay silent, and then one day the truth landed in your lap, what would you do? Because I'm not walking away quietly anymore. I didn't walk out of that church a hero. I walked out with my hands shaking, my mouth dry, my whole body humming with something between rage and heartbreak. But it wasn't new. That feeling, that hollow throb behind my ribs, it had been there for years, long before the badge, long before the secrets, long before the voicemail that changed everything. You want to know why I never told my father who I really was? It's not because I was afraid he'd be angry. It's because I knew he wouldn't care. Growing up in the Clarke household meant there was only one currency that mattered: toughness. Real toughness. Grit your teeth, don't you dare cry toughness. It didn't matter if you were bleeding inside or falling apart behind your smile. If you couldn't run a mile in under 7 minutes or fire a perfect grouping at the range, you were background noise. Nate thrived in that world. He came out of the womb ready to impress, ready to salute, ready to carry the family name like a trophy. And I read too much, talked too little, and asked too many questions that made people uncomfortable. Questions like, why does dad always call me kiddo but never by my name? Or, why does mom look so sad when she thinks no one's watching? I remember once, when I was 12, I overheard my father telling someone on the phone, Nate's going to carry the torch. Eliza, she's smart, sure, but not built for this life. I just made honor roll. I'd just beaten every boy in class on the math exam. And yet, that one sentence stayed louder in my head than any applause. I think that's when I started disappearing. Not all at once, but in little pieces. I stopped volunteering answers in class. I stopped asking to tag along when Nate and Dad went to the shooting range. I started shrinking myself, sanding down the sharp edges. And when it came time to apply for colleges, I didn't tell anyone that I'd also applied to Quantico. I didn't want a conversation, I wanted escape. The day I got my acceptance letter to the FBI's field agent program, I sat in the back booth of a diner 5 towns over and cried into a grilled cheese sandwich. Not because I was scared, but because I realized no one in my family would ask why I was gone, and they didn't. I trained harder than I ever thought I could. I ran until my lungs burned. I learned to shoot, to fight, to listen for the things people didn't say. And every time I thought about quitting, I imagined my father's face, blank, unimpressed, and I kept going. 6 years passed. 6 years of going deeper and deeper into work that never made the news. Corruption cases, high-risk intel transfers, counterinfiltration. I moved through cities like a shadow, changed aliases more times than I could count. But no matter how deep I went, a part of me always circled back to Nate. Not because he knew, but because I think, deep down, he always saw more than he let on. We didn't talk often, but when we did, it was never about family. It was about the job, about the cracks in the system, the way things didn't add up. He once told me, you'd be amazed how many people wear a badge for power, not protection. That stuck with me, especially now, because if anyone understood what it meant to feel like an outsider in your own home, it was Nate. And maybe that's why he called me. Maybe, in the end, he realized I was the only one who wouldn't buy the lie. The only one who had been trained not just to see it, but to follow it. And that's exactly what I planned to do. I didn't go straight back to DC after the funeral. I told my team I needed 72 hours of personal time, no questions asked. They agreed. Bureaucracy has its flaws, but when you bury a sibling, people tend to give you space. What they didn't know, and what I wasn't ready to say out loud yet, was that this wasn't personal time. It was a quiet war declaration. I drove out to the alley where they said he died. It was behind a liquor store that had changed owners 3 times in 5 years. The kind of place that sells single cigarettes in plastic baggies and turns a blind eye when someone leans too long against the side wall. The report said Nate chased a suspect through here during a drug sting, lost visual, and caught a bullet. No cameras, no witnesses, just blood on the pavement and an officer down. But here, what didn't add up. Nate never worked street-level stings. Not anymore. He'd been on a special assignment rotation for over 8 months, working directly under Lieutenant Morrison, someone who'd conveniently gone on leave the day after Nate's death. The kind of leave where no one answers their phone and their wife says he needed a break from everything. I stood in that alley, the sun burning the back of my neck, and I tried to imagine the last few seconds of Nate's life. He was smart. He was fast, and he was careful. If he got shot, it wasn't because he got sloppy. It was because someone made damn sure he didn't walk out. There was a stain on the brick wall about shoulder height. It looked scrubbed, like someone tried too hard to clean what couldn't be erased. I stared at it for too long. Maybe because part of me hoped the wall would talk back. Or maybe because that's what grief does, it makes you believe in things that aren't there. I stepped back and scanned the street. No cameras, no angles, except one. A rusted-out security dome hung above the liquor store's back door, tilted just enough to maybe catch the edge of the alley. I knocked twice hard, no answer. I showed my badge at the front, made the clerk stutter, and within minutes I had access to the DVR. Most of the files had been overwritten, except one, labeled manually. Time-stamped for the night Nate died. It was only 12 seconds long. No sound, just a shadow. A silhouette walking away from the scene, not running, walking, like nothing had just happened. I paused the frame, zoomed. The quality was garbage. But the build, the stance, it felt familiar. Too familiar. Not Nate, not a suspect, not even a dealer. Someone in uniform. My stomach dropped. I copied the file, locked it in a drive only I could access, and left without saying a word. Back in my car, I sat with the engine off, the world suddenly too loud outside the windows. This wasn't a robbery gone bad. This wasn't a drug bust gone sideways. This was deliberate. This was inside. And whoever did it, they weren't hiding in the shadows. They were standing in the light, wearing the same badge my brother died carrying. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there in the motel bed with the ceiling fan spinning like a slow interrogation light above me, watching shadows shift on the popcorn ceiling, trying not to think about how familiar that walk was. The person in that video, the silhouette with the calm steps, the stiff posture, it wasn't just anyone. It was someone trained. Someone who knew not to run because they wouldn't need to. That kind of stillness isn't fear. It's confidence. The kind of confidence that comes when you know nobody's going to ask you questions, because you've already been written into the right side of the story. I drove to the precinct the next morning without a plan, just a quiet fire in my chest and a badge in my pocket. The place looked the same, brick walls, faded flag, a hand-painted sign above the reception that read to protect and serve with honor. I used to believe that sign. Used to stand under it as a kid, waiting for Dad and Nate to finish shifts, proud to be a Clarke. But today, the letters felt hollow, like they were just waiting for someone to peel them off. The woman at the front desk didn't recognize me. That was good. I didn't want the kind of reunion that came with hugs or fake condolences. I just wanted names, files, patterns. She pointed me upstairs and I walked through the halls like a ghost, past desks cluttered with paperwork and coffee cups, past faces that half-registered but didn't greet. Nobody made eye contact. That's what grief does in places like this. It makes everyone polite enough to nod, but distant enough not to ask. When I reached Captain Grayson's office, I didn't knock. I pushed the door open like I belonged there. He looked up slowly, blinking like he'd seen a ghost. And maybe he had. I used to come to his barbecues when I was 10. He gave me my first ride-along in middle school. He told me once that if I were born a boy, I'd make a hell of a detective. I never forgot that. I never forgot the way he said it, like it was a compliment, like I should be grateful. "Eliza," he said, standing halfway like he wasn't sure whether to hug me or salute. I'm sorry about Nate." I nodded because I wasn't here for condolences. I was here for what he wouldn't say. "I need access to the internal case report," I said. "The real one." He blinked again. "What are you talking about? It's already been filed." "Not the one you gave the press," I interrupted. "Not the watered-down narrative with the missing footage and the cleaned-up timelines. The real report, the last GPS ping, the dispatch logs, the body cam entries, even if they malfunctioned. All of it." His face shifted, not shocked, not offended, just tired. "You think there's something off?" "I don't think, I know." We stared at each other for a moment, the silence heavy between us. I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was trying to decide how much I already knew, how much he could give me without implicating himself, how much he owed Nate, and how much he owed his pension. Finally, he stood, walked to a cabinet behind his desk, pulled a folder so thin it looked like it had been curated, not compiled. He handed it to me without meeting my eyes. "That's everything we've got," he said. I didn't even open it. I just stared at him. "Did you know he reached out to me before he died?" I asked. Grayson froze. "No, I didn't." "He did. He was scared. Not of the street, not of some junkie with a gun. He was scared of you, of the people in this building. And I think you know why." He sat down slowly, the chair creaking under the weight of something heavier than his body. He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. And that told me everything I needed to know. Because silence, in places like this, is the loudest confession of all. I waited until I was out of the building to breathe again. The folder Grayson gave me felt light in my hands, but heavy in my chest. Like a coffin with no body. Like closure with no truth. I didn't open it right away. I sat in my car, engine off, hands still on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead like if I blinked too fast the whole thing would collapse. And maybe it already had. I flipped it open. First page, an incident summary. Typed, signed, sealed, sterile, clinical. No mention of the text I got, no mention of Nate's suspicions. Just, Officer Nathan Clarke pursued an unidentified suspect and was shot during the course of duty. A single sentence to summarize a life. A single paragraph to bury a man. Second page, dispatch logs, time-stamped. routine, until I saw it. A 12-second gap between when Nate called in his location and when they claimed he went radio silent. That was the moment something changed. It wasn't long, but it was enough. Then the third page. A partial audio file, no transcript, just a raw clip attached by an officer I didn't recognize. The name was scratched out in pen, like someone changed their mind about taking credit. I played it. Static. Then Nate's voice, breathless, fast, like he was running. They found me, no backup, don't trust. Click, that was it. 3 seconds of truth, buried under 300 pages of procedure. I listened to it again, and again, until his voice stopped sounding like memory and started sounding like a warning. I thought I was ready for this part, but hearing him, really hearing him, cracked something open inside me I'd spent years welding shut, because I remembered that voice. Not just from case briefings or birthday voicemails, but from when we were kids, when he'd sneak into my room after another screaming match downstairs, curl up on the floor with a flashlight, and read from whatever library book I'd hidden under the bed. He used to read in this fast, low tone, like if the story got interrupted, it might disappear. And now, years later, he sounded just like that, as if his voice was the last thing holding the truth together. I clutched the flash drive so tightly it left an imprint in my palm. This wasn't just a brother asking for help. This was a man, in his last moments, handing me the torch. And for a brief, brutal second, I hated him for it. Not because I didn't want to help. I knew I'd have to see him eventually. Knew the moment I found that audio clip, the name on the timestamp, the voice Nate barely choked out, it all pointed in one direction. To someone who wasn't just a former colleague. He was family in every way that mattered more than blood. Sergeant Paul Denning. My father's oldest friend. Nate's mentor. The man who taught me how to wrap my fists before a punch, who gave me my first copy of The Art of War like it was a rite of passage. I used to think of him as a second father, one who listened when mine didn't, one who believed in quiet competence over loud medals. And now, he was the person my brother feared in the final seconds of his life. I parked outside his house just past midnight. I didn't knock. I'd picked the lock like we were still playing one of those old field exercises, get in, get the truth, get out. His place hadn't changed in years. Same photo frames lining the mantel. Officers in uniform, handshakes frozen in time, smiling at the camera like their secrets couldn't bleed through film. And right there in the center, Nate, fresh-faced, next to Paul, arms slung like brothers. I stared at it longer than I meant to. That version of them didn't exist anymore. Maybe it never did. He came out of the hallway in a t-shirt and boxers, holding a glass of water and blinking through the dark like he wasn't surprised. Maybe he was, maybe people like him always know when the truth finally grows teeth. "Eliza," he said, quiet. "You were there," I said. No greeting, no hesitation. Just the truth, stripped of ceremony, he didn't deny it. He sat down slowly, like his bones couldn't carry the weight of what I already knew. "I tried to warn him off," he muttered. "Told him to stop digging." "You tried to scare him," I snapped. "There's a difference." He looked up at me, and in his eyes I didn't see guilt. I saw exhaustion, and that made it worse. "You don't understand what was at stake. Try me." He leaned forward, fingers pressed together, the way he always did when he was about to lie and hoped you'd mistake it for sincerity. "Your brother found something he wasn't supposed to, about the task force, about the money. There were names that go all the way up. I told him to drop it. Hell, I begged him, but he wouldn't, you know how he was." I laughed sharp, dry, the kind of sound that only comes when your bodies run out of ways to cry. "You're damn right I knew how he was. That's why he called me instead of you. Because even when he was scared out of his mind, he still believed someone out there would do the right thing. And it sure as hell wasn't you." He stood up, voice rising. "I didn't pull the trigger." "No," I said, stepping closer, "but you put him in the alley. You sent the message. You told the wolves where to find him and left the door unlocked." Silence fell between us like a dropped glass. "I loved him," he whispered. "Then why didn't you protect him?" His jaw clenched, his hands curled at his sides, but he didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say, not really. I turned to leave, but paused at the door. "You don't get to mourn him now," I said without looking back. "You already chose your side." And when I stepped into the night, the air didn't feel like air. It felt like ash. Like every breath I took was smoke from a fire no one tried to put out. For the first time since Nate died, I stopped hoping for justice. I wanted reckoning. I didn't plan to speak, not at the vigil, not in front of the town, not in front of my father. But sometimes the silence starts to rot, and if you don't cut it open, it eats everything. So I stood there, under the old war memorial where they'd set up folding chairs and candles and cheap plastic flags. The kind of vigil that makes people feel like they did something, even if they didn't lift a damn finger while he was alive. Nate's foe sat on a stand surrounded by flowers too bright to be real. His uniform framed behind glass like a painting. I looked out at the crowd, neighbors, former teachers, men who used to pat his back and call him son. And in the front row, my father, arms crossed, jaw set, wearing the same tie he'd worn to my high school graduation. He hadn't spoken to me since the funeral. Not even when the truth started to leak, about my badge, about the case, about who I really was. He'd always had this talent for pretending things didn't exist unless he could control them. And I was never one of those things. Someone handed me the microphone. I didn't thank them. I didn't clear my throat. I just looked down at the paper I didn't plan to read from, and then folded it in half and let it fall. "My name is Eliza Clarke," I said, voice steady even as my hands trembled. "Some of you know me, most of you don't. And that's by design. I spent the last 6 years working cases I couldn't talk about, wearing identities I couldn't keep, chasing truths no one wanted to hear. And while you all thought I was tucked away behind a dispatch desk, I was somewhere else. Watching, learning, surviving. The silence that followed was heavy, not with judgment, but disbelief. Like they didn't know where to put me now that I didn't fit inside the version of me they'd built. My brother, I continued, wasn't just a good cop. He was a good man, and he died trying to do the right thing. He died because he found something dirty, something deep. And someone made sure he wouldn't live to tell it. You want to honor him? Don't light another candle. Don't post another tribute. Ask yourself why he had to whisper the truth to me instead of shouting it from this very stage. I looked straight at my father. He didn't blink. "You always said I wasn't built for this," I said, my voice quieter now. "That I didn't have what it takes, but I was never the weak one. I was just the one you couldn't control." I paused, long enough to let the weight of it settle. Then I let go. "I'm not here to ask for your approval or your pity. I'm here because I won't let his story end in lies, and if you want to help, get out of my way. If you don't, well, I've spent my whole life doing this alone." I handed the mic back without looking at the crowd. I didn't need applause. I wasn't performing. I was telling the truth the only way I knew how, raw, unpolished, and loud enough to echo where it needed to. As I stepped down, someone reached out and touched my arm. A woman, mid-S, I didn't know her, but her eyes were red and her hand was steady. "My daughter's on the force," she said, voice low. "She told me about the files. About the cover-up, she's scared. But she said, if you needed someone who saw it too." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. I nodded. For the first time, I wasn't alone. And maybe that wouldn't bring Nate back. But it meant his death wouldn't vanish quietly into the system that failed him. It meant the story was just beginning. The fallout didn't come all at once. It never does. It trickles in, like a faucet you can't tighten, drip by drip, until your silence is flooded with the sound of people turning their backs. The first call I got was from HR. "Standard protocol," they said. "Pending review. You're not being punished," they assured me, "just reassigned, reevaluated, reconsidered." I didn't even bother to ask what that meant. I already knew. I'd spoken out. I'd made them uncomfortable. That's all it ever takes. The second blow came quieter. A colleague, someone I'd trained with, shared war stories and cheap whiskey with, left my texts on read, then disappeared. Like we'd never known each other at all. I stopped reaching out after the third time. You can only knock on a closed door so many times before you start wondering if it was ever yours to open. But the worst part wasn't the bureau. It wasn't the whispers or the emails that never got answered. It wasn't even the news article that called me the rogue sister or the internal memo that questioned my emotional objectivity. No. The worst part was watching my father on local TV, standing next to the new police chief, shaking hands like none of this touched him. Like his son hadn't died under their watch. Like his daughter hadn't just bled truth across a microphone in front of the whole damn town. He didn't mention my name. He never does. That's how I knew I'd done the right thing. Truth has a price. I just underestimated how many parts of myself I'd have to spend to pay it. The apartment felt colder these days. Not because the heater was broken, but because silence doesn't insulate. it amplifies. Every floorboard creak sounded like a question. Every time I reached for my phone and remembered there was no one left to call, it felt like another small funeral. And yet, I wasn't grieving. Not really. I was shedding. The lies. The doubt. The weight of performing politeness for people who never saw me as whole. I was still standing. That had to count for something. Some nights I still listened to Nate's audio clip. Not because I needed the reminder, but because I needed to hear a voice that didn't doubt me. That believed I was the one who'd finish this, even if it cost everything. And the strange thing, the fear that used to keep me up at night, of being alone, of being wrong, of not being enough, it was gone. Not because it got easier, but because I'd already lost what mattered most, and I was still here. It came in the form of a letter. Not an email, not a document in an encrypted drive. A real letter, creased, handwritten, slipped through my mail slot like a ghost. No return address. No signature. Just 3 words on the front, ink pressed deep into the paper like a wound. For your eyes. Inside there were 2 things, a printed photo and a memory card. I stared at the photo for a long time. It was blurry, taken from across a street. But I knew the faces. Paul Denning, Lieutenant Morrison, and someone else, someone I didn't recognize right away, but whose posture, whose smile, whose presence felt like it didn't belong. I turned the photo over. 1 sentence in the same handwriting, "This is who ordered it." My fingers shook as I slotted the memory card into my laptop. The video opened instantly. No password, no interface. Just a frozen first frame, a desk, a nameplate, Morrison's office. I hit play. It wasn't a long clip, just under 4 minutes, but time stretched inside it like a scream underwater. Paul's voice first, low and measured. He's not letting it go. He sent his sister a message, if she digs too. Morrison, she's a dispatcher. She's nothing. She'll grieve and move on. Paul again, a little quieter. You sure about that? Then silence. Just the sound of a pen tapping the desk. And then Morrison, cold as glass. Then you know what to do. The screen went black. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my laptop across the room or pound my fists into the wall. I just sat there breathing, slow, mechanical, like my body had learned to survive long before my soul caught up. That clip wasn't just proof, it was everything. Everything they said didn't happen. Everything they told the papers. Everything they erased from the files. Everything Nate feared. And now it was in my hands. I could upload it, right now, with a single click. Burn it all down, name names, send it to every news outlet from here to Washington. There was enough there to end careers, to launch investigations, to bring the whole rotten system to its knees. But the question wasn't, could I? It was, should I? Because I knew what would happen next. The lawsuits, the media circus, the retaliation, the whispers that I faked it, that I doctored the video, that I was just a grieving sister looking for attention. And worse, I knew what it would do to my mother. She'd already lost 1 child. If I became a target, she'd lose another. I closed the laptop slowly, my hands steady even as my chest ached. This wasn't a moment of doubt. It was a moment of choice. To scream or to strike. To survive or to destroy. To be the sister who brought the truth to light. Or the woman who walked away, carrying it alone. And somewhere deep inside, I heard Nate's voice. Not begging, not warning. Just 1 word, the way he used to say it when I was ready to give up on anything. Finish. I didn't release the video. I could have, I had it. Every second, every voice, every quiet betrayal. But something in me needed to breathe first, outside the noise, the grief, the weight of being right too late. So I left. I drove to the old cabin Nate and I used to sneak off to his kids, where silence wasn't empty, just honest. I made terrible coffee, sat wrapped in the same blanket we once spilled hot chocolate on, and let the cold remind me I was still alive. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own life. I didn't feel like just a sister, just a woman, just background noise to other people's decisions. I felt real. I wrote it down, too, 1 line, I am not what they buried. Maybe that's what Nate saw in me all along. Not someone who would fight loudly, but someone who would carry the truth carefully until it was ready to live.